Go. So the meeting now is being recorded. My name again is Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester and host of the Forest Connect webinar series. And tonight it's my pleasure to introduce to you Shorna Broussard-Allred, who's a colleague and friend here in the Department of Natural Resources. She's a forester. She's an associate professor and a specialist in human dimensions, which is the process of understanding how people think about natural resources, I guess is the way I would describe that. So with that introduction, I am going to turn the microphone over to Shorna, and I can assure you you're going to have a great presentation. Shorna did a wonderful job at noon, and she's going to do another great job tonight. So Shorna, welcome.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that introduction, and also welcome to all the participants. Thank you for joining us here this evening for the webinar that I'll be discussing timber harvesting aesthetics with you this evening. So I'd just like to thank Peter Smallage for organizing this webinar series. This is a two-part webinar series. Some of you may have been on the Timber Harvesting Aesthetics Part 1, which was last month, where Andy Egan talked about kind of the ecological aspects of harvesting. And this evening, I'll be talking more about the social dimensions, about perceptions, about how people perceive harvesting, and how what factors influence that. I'd like to, at this time, acknowledge my co-author on this presentation, Shannon Rogers, who was my former graduate student at Purdue University, and she is not able to join us this evening. She just started a new job and is not able to join us, but I wanted to acknowledge her because part of what I'll be talking about later this evening was the subject of her master's research. So you'll get to hear lots about that as we progress through the webinar this evening. Just a little bit about the logistics. Feel free to type in questions in the chat pod. I will pause periodically and have discussion. So we had a great interactive session at noon, and I welcome questions throughout the presentation, so feel free. So this evening we'll be talking about public perceptions of timber harvesting and really thinking about, well, how are they formed, what factors influence them, and what are current perceptions about timber harvesting and silvicultural treatments on forest lands. And we'll talk about it from the perspectives of the general public as well as foresters and woodland owners. So why public perceptions? Public perceptions are important because of course, a lot of policy actions by both individuals and organizations in response to those perceptions can have a significant impact. And when we are talking about public perceptions, it really comes down to this concept of social acceptability, that when people view forests, when they recreate in forests, they sort of judge them in a sense. There's this process by which people find practices either socially acceptable or unacceptable or somewhere in between. And social acceptability in forest management is this process by which people compare the perceived reality with its known alternatives and decide whether that condition is similar to what they prefer, their favorable alternatives. So if they see a clear cut, that's going to be compared to alternative conditions that they have in their mind. And so social acceptability is really relative in a sense, that when people's perceptions of forests and forest practices are really things that are relative to their perceptions of what a forest should look like in their mind. And so people are judging against these alternatives constantly. And another point is that with regard to social acceptability is that if there is this incongruence between what they see and what they'd like to see, most people going to have a propensity to actually engage in behavior that would shift towards a more favorable alternative. So that those types of actions might be involved with a constituency group, for example. The study that I'll be talking about in Indiana was actually motivated because of constituent pressure that one of the on the state agency against timber harvesting and silvicultural treatments. And so we undertook a study to examine these public perceptions, because oftentimes these perceptions are linked to actions which are detrimental to practicing good forestry. So social acceptability of forest management is, of course, influenced by many things, by the science of forest management, by knowledge, by a person's experience, their ethics, their attitudes, their history with the parcel or piece of land, geographic and social context. So when we think about perceptions, it's really not just about that forest, but about how people are interacting with that landscape, how they're recreating in it, what their experience is, their experience in other areas. And so a lot of times these things are all bundled together. And so as a social scientist, it becomes really challenging to think about, well, how do we influence those perceptions when they are linked to so many different aspects of who we are? Social acceptability, because it is linked and it's complex and formed over time, it's also not going to change strictly based on technical understanding. So this idea of well, if we could just educate people about landscapes, then they'll change their behavior or they'll change their social acceptability. There's some truth in that, but it's change won't happen strictly based on this kind of technical understanding. Carl asks if this is an effort in sociology. Definitely sociology and psychology are underlying a lot of the principles which I'm talking about today. And also, how close is perception to reality? We could have a whole webinar on that, on perception versus reality. I mean, it's an interesting question because in many cases, it probably doesn't matter. A lot of times perception is very different than reality, but as long as the person holds that perception, it's real to them, and so it becomes manifested in many ways. And so I think that's something we often struggle with, is perceptions are not always accurate. Okay, so let's talk about clearcutting, which is, of course, one silvicultural tool for managing forests. And of course, this is one of the most controversial forest management practices there is. And as you could probably guess, this is probably not a surprise to you. Many research studies have shown that there's significant opposition to clearcutting, especially on public lands. And so it's mainly linked to this visual aesthetic, that clear cuts are visually unappealing to many people. And so and many of the reactions to clear cutting show that it's really based on people's sort of emotional responses to the way these landscapes actually look. Andy Egan, Professor Egan, who did the webinar last month on this topic, had done a study looking at the views of professional foresters on clearcutting and forest policy, and this was in the Northeast, in Maine, Ohio, and West Virginia. And he found that foresters, the majority of foresters, are opposed to banning clearcutting, but do believe that there are policies that should limit their size, and they did expect to see more regulation of forest practices in the future and more input from environmental groups in creating forest policy. So professional foresters, about 7 years ago, really did feel that forest practices may be more regulated in the future, and we're seeing some of this happen with local ordinances being passed by municipalities that may limit forest practices, and sometimes those policies are not so well informed. Um, Carl asked that maybe this is like in a sales effort. We need to get our point across so that stakeholders will buy in. That's certainly part of it. That we as a forestry profession, as forestry educators, as professional foresters, could definitely communicate about forest practices and their purpose quite effectively. I'll talk about some studies where forestry educators, extension specialists, etc., have had success in gaining that kind of buy-in from stakeholders. So I'll talk about a few specific examples where that actually has worked. But first, I want to talk about a study that I did with my graduate students, where we did a national survey of public attitudes toward timber harvesting. And this was about harvesting in general. It wasn't about a specific silvicultural treatment. This was a survey of the general public, and we looked at 3 different types of attitudes. We looked at attitudes towards harvesting trees generally. And then we asked about harvesting for specific benefits or outcomes, harvesting for economic gain for the woodland owner, or for forest products that could be used by society, and also harvesting as a management tool in terms of planting and harvesting to prevent forest fires and to improve the residual stand. So we asked about 3 different types of attitudes. And we found that there was most support among the U.S. public for harvesting as a management tool. So when timber harvesting was being done for a forest health or forest productivity purpose, 96% of the U.S. population agreed and supported. There was social acceptability for that. We found that there was also fairly strong support for harvesting for economic benefit to the landowner or for actual forest products. About 51% were supportive of harvesting for that reason. We found that only about 5% agreed with just general harvesting. And this gets at one of the key points, which is, sort of why foresters conduct timber harvest and silvicultural treatments is so important, and communicating that is really key, because if we're just talking about harvesting just for harvesting's sake, there's not very much support for it. But when we're supporting an economy, when we're supporting income for woodland owners, when we're supporting the sustainability of forests, we see much stronger support. And the interesting thing in this particular study that we found was that we surveyed the general public, and we also surveyed woodland owners nationally, and their attitudes were the same. There were no significant differences between woodland owners and a random sample of the general public. So we see that these attitudes are fairly widely held among the U.S. population, landowners and non-landowners as well. So what does this come down to? Carl, let's see your question. I think that a key type of timber harvesting may be harvesting that has minimal adverse environmental impact and still cost effective. Yes, Carl. In that particular study, we didn't look at the type of timber harvesting. Actually, I'm going to go into in the next few slides about some specific silvicultural practices, but we do find that there is a correlation between stand density and acceptability, so that the more trees you remove, the less people are likely to accept it. So I do think that the environmental impact, as well as sort of the visual impact, is something that affects acceptability. So the type of harvesting does indeed matter. So when we're looking at perceptions, it really relates to 2 kinds of aesthetics: a scenic aesthetic and an ecological aesthetic. The scenic aesthetic is, when people derive pleasure from viewing the environment. And this is why we see a lot of opposition to clear cutting, because it doesn't appeal to someone's scenic aesthetic. which is why it's important that we think about how to foster an ecological aesthetic in society, that people not only derive pleasure from viewing the environment, but also from knowing that it's being sustainably managed, that it's ecologically fit, if you will. And because the scenic aesthetic is such a part of our culture, these, an aesthetic for a scenic park-like setting versus other types of environmentally or sustainable harvests, it's difficult to see ecological beauty, so it's harder for people to understand that and to accept practices that do promote a healthy and diverse but messier looking forest, if you will. This is something that we're looking at in a current study we're working on in New York, looking at early successional habitat on forest lands, which is not always the most visually appealing forests to look at, because these are young forests. They're not mature forests, they're young, and they have structure, so they're more even-aged kind of management practices. And they don't look as neat as an old growth forest, for example. And so it becomes challenging to think about, well, the benefits of early successional habitat for birds, for wildlife, for game and non-game species is so critical. But communicating that ecological aesthetic is sometimes challenging, but it's also at the heart of what we need, what's necessary if we really want to influence perceptions in a positive way and to influence awareness. So ecological and scenic aesthetics, these are the two types of aesthetics that I mentioned. And Paul Gopster, who's done some work in this area, said that for this type of ecological aesthetic to become understood and appreciated, it must be seen and it must be experienced. He calls this conspicuous experiential quality, that it will help speed the diffusion of change in aesthetic expectations. And I'll talk in a few minutes about a study that we did in Pennsylvania, where we really tried to foster this experiential experience with woodland owners and with youth in Pennsylvania to really try to foster this ecological aesthetic. And we had set up demonstration forests which had multiple silvicultural treatments as part of this 12-acre demonstration forest, with a trail that we could take woodland owners around, take them through a 2-acre clear cut, take them through a 2-acre high grade, which is something we weren't promoting, but we wanted to show what that looked like and what the impact of that detrimental harvesting practice is to forest lands. We looked at shelter woods, we looked at a shelter wood and group selection, and a thinning as well. So it was really interesting to do that, because we really had this sort of experiential component to to talking about these silvicultural treatments, and through that we were able to significantly impact attitudes and awareness. So this is the million-dollar question, which is, how do we influence perceptions of forest management? What is the role of information and education in influencing perceptions of forest management? We know from research that it's not always a simple cause and effect relationship, that simply by supplying information does not mean that that there will be a positive effect on acceptability. There are many things that influence whether information will be effective. The credibility, so who's conveying the information? Is it from a credible, respected source? The timing of that information, whether it's coming from a public land manager after the harvest is done versus before. There's ideal timing, the type of information, and again, that fact that everybody's, in terms of social acceptability, people are making judgments with their current sources of information, whether those sources are accurate or not. So the link between scientific and other forms of information, lay forms of information, personal experience. All of these are often what people evaluate things based on. We also know that aesthetic judgments are highly affective, meaning that they're often emotional, that these visual aesthetic judgments are often sort of this visceral emotional reaction to what landscapes look like. And because of that, it's not always easy to determine what kind of interpretation and conclusions will be drawn from the information that you provide. So simply providing information doesn't mean it will be interpreted properly or interpreted in the way you intend, should I say. So that's another piece as well, is to see, well, how are people interpreting the information that I am providing? So again, with the role of information, we know that a person's perception of a forest scene can be influenced by providing information about that. So there's been quite a few studies that have shown various types of forest management practices and also provided people with information about it, and found that that can actually influence their acceptability of that particular management practice. There's also been a study that didn't find that information made a difference. And so we know that the information can affect scenic beauty judgments, social acceptability judgments, but it's a very complex decision that's influenced by many factors, and researchers are still, I think, trying to figure out how we can influence what the role of information is. The other piece is that disinterested people are more likely to react from emotion versus cognition versus a rational process. People that are more interested, more engaged, more aware are probably going to evaluate forest practices not only emotionally but also cognitively, really thinking about that particular practice. So depending on where a person is in their forestry awareness can also impact the types of perceptions that that person may have about a particular forest practice. So let's talk about a few studies. This one was done in Michigan with landowners that lived adjacent to the Hiawatha National Forest, and they were the managers there were interested in two practices. One of them was looking at the beneficial aspects of using periodic patch cuts to maintain paper birch stands. The other forest management practice that they were interested in doing was converting pine plantations, jack pine plantations, to natural stands. And so to do that, they needed to clear cut the jack pine plantations. So they were really looking at these two types of treatments that they were wanting to do on the Hiawatha National Forest. So they contacted the adjacent landowners as a way to engage those stakeholders prior to actually doing this harvest. And so what they did was provide information about these two treatments. So why were they wanting to clear cut? Why were they doing these periodic patch cuts? And so they showed photographs of these scenes and also provided information. And they found that providing that information did increase the landowners' preferences for those scenes. So without that information, individuals were much less likely to favor a clear cutting scene, but when they understood that it was for the purpose of converting a plantation to a natural stand, they were much more likely to find that management practice acceptable. And in this study, they also asked about expertise in forest management and found that the results, the acceptability, was independent of expertise in forest management. That was an interesting study. Here's another study where these are both about public lands, but this study was in Oregon at the McDonald Forest, which is one of the university lands, and that's managed by the College of Forestry there. And they were going to undertake some significant harvesting on that land, and there was conflict with the neighboring residents, with the landowners and the residents that live adjacent to to this forest. And so they decided to go through a stakeholder process to really start have a discussion with the residents about the alternatives. So they put together a meeting, a 30-minute slideshow, basically going over all of these alternatives. So 3 to 5 acre clear cuts, 1 to 4 acre patch cuts with thinnings, a quarter acre cut, and a single and group tree selection. And so they went through and went through the pros and cons of each of these different types of alternatives. And through this discussion, they found that people favored the existing plan when they had information. So this gets back to the kind of credibility, the timing, the type of information. All of those factors are key. So residents wanted to know when the harvesting was going to occur. They wanted to see that there was a plan for regrowth and regeneration. They wanted to see where the future harvesting would occur. They wanted to see that fewer locations were to be harvested. And those that were in favor of the quarter acre patch cuts or single and group tree selection, which are the least heavy-handed treatments, if you will, in terms of stand density, found that aesthetic appeal was the reason. And so that definitely comes up time and time again, that people favor more well-stocked forests, greater stand densities. So sort of how we communicate information is very critical, and in this case was very effective in diffusing some pretty contentious conflict over harvesting of these university forest lands. So they found that this, just having this sort of slideshow going through all of the alternatives was really helpful in helping the residents gain that knowledge about forest management practices and the goals associated with them. That's so critical, is the link between the management practice and the goal that's being achieved. Also, there was a large number of participants who participated in the presentation that decided to learn about what these management practices and alternatives were. And so it showed that there was really interest from the community members in learning about this. Carl says one needs to be careful with the distribution of information so as not to send the wrong message. That's certainly true. Again, you're never sure how people are interpreting the information that you give, so it is important that the information be communicated in such a way that that it's clear, and that hopefully that type of misinterpretation is minimized. And with some people, too much knowledge is dangerous. That's a very good point. But in this case, the knowledge and the information was effective in helping people understand the alternatives. So it wasn't pushing them towards one alternative or another, but it was just showing them how to better understand the goals associated with the management practices. And then they can make an informed decision about what which path they would like to choose. Let's see, one more question. Jim Daniels, the costs of an effective PR program are large, and the very existence of such a program may suggest a greater than actual empowerment of outside stakeholders over a landowner decision. Are we going down the right avenue by thinking of PR like this? The activities that I'm talking about today are not really public relations. These are more educational, and so again, PR, public relations, I think the big difference between that and education is that PR really has this trying to sell a message or a statement, whereas education with the study that I just mentioned, it was really providing people with knowledge about alternatives, and then they can make their own decision, whereas PR would really be advocating for one particular position over another. So I think that's a really key point, is that you don't want to, in communicating, seem as if you're advocating or for one particular alternative over the other, but you allow individuals to sort of make up their own mind after hearing the information. Because one of the reasons that I'm really interested in this is because I don't think that it's effective when policy is adversarial, but when there's people that are opposing harvesting, especially this happens on public lands more so than private. But I think that you really do want to have an informed decision making process. And certainly with on private lands, with forest landowners, you certainly would not want the decision making authority impacted. So I think that that's really critical. Yes, it's to keep it as a non-biased approach when you're communicating about things that can be controversial. So it's very critical when you are talking about something like clear cutting or any kind of harvesting, is that you do really present this non-biased approach of, well, here's the goal. This is why we'd like to do this clear cut. It's to regenerate the natural stands, or we really would like to maintain paper birch, and to do so, these are the types of treatments. Or if we need oak regeneration, this is the type of even age management that we need to conduct, but rather than advocating for a specific position. Excuse me. So here's a study that was done in Washington about clear cuts, and this again shows the role of kind of information. They were presented with a statement of, I don't always like how clear cuts look, but if it means the land will remain in forestry rather than being converted to housing and commercial developments, then it's acceptable. So 69% of Washington voters agreed with this statement, so very strong support. So so this really wasn't talking about clear cutting as a silvicultural treatment, but they kind of jumped from clear cuts to forest conversion. Comparing those two things, what do you like worse, or what do you like better, a clear cut or a housing development? People clearly prefer a clear cut. So it's all relative. This is that point that I started out making, is that it's all relative. People are always making these judgments, comparing it to other alternatives. Here's another statement about clear cutting. State laws require that trees be left next to streams to prevent soil erosion. People are 61% more likely to favor clear cutting if that's the case. And they're 72% more likely to favor clear cutting if state laws require that trees be replanted and growing within 3 years after a clear cut. So I think that this gets at that idea of it's harvesting, but if it's done properly, if it's done to minimize the environmental impact, people's perceptions are much more favorable. So I think that protecting water quality and preventing soil erosion, having regeneration of forests that are clear cut, something that people really care about, and at least of the survey of Washington voters. This was the plurality of individuals were more likely to favor harvesting. So this idea of fostering an ecological aesthetic about the sustainability aspects of forest management is something that can actually be effective in altering or influencing in a positive way perceptions about forest management practices. So here's the study that I alluded to earlier that we conducted in Pennsylvania, and I know we have a few people here from Pennsylvania on the webinar today. But this was two studies that were done with Steve Jones and Jim Finley and Larry Nielsen in when they were at Penn State. Jim Finley's still there. Steve Jones is no longer there, or Larry Nilsson. But we constructed several demonstration forests where they were about 12 acres each. And we had these 2-acre forest practice treatments across the 12 acres. And so it was definitely something that was walkable. And what we did was we developed a educational curriculum associated with this demonstration forest where we could take woodland owners out. And we also took youth out to talk about clear cutting, to talk about thinning, the importance of thinning, to talk about why you would do a shelterwood harvest or a silvicultural treatment like group selection. And so one of the things that we found was that by participating in this experiential learning experience in a demonstration forest, that it increased understanding of forest stewardship as evidenced by increased knowledge about forest practices, as well as attitudes that were much more positive in terms of forest management for both adults, which were the forest landowners, and youth, which were elementary and middle school children. And so the demonstration area was much more effective as an educational method for fostering positive attitudes about forestry. We also did non-experiential learning experiences in the classroom, and then we took them out in the forest, and we found that, of course, being out in the forest, being able to see the different forest practices and talk about them really did impact their attitudes in a way that we couldn't by strictly talking about this in a classroom setting. Carl, your question about clear cutting on steep slopes, that's certainly an issue. Forest practices like harvesting do impact soil, especially on steep slopes. And actually, Andy Egan talked about that quite a bit at his seminar last month. So if you have a chance, I would look at his recorded webinar. And he also gave a webinar. Peter, you'll have to remind me of what month it was. It was sometime in the summer. I think it might have been in June or July, where he talked about soil and water quality impacts of harvesting. And those were both really excellent webinars that went over that in excuse me, in detail. And so I would definitely recommend looking at the archives for Andy Egan if you're interested in exploring those kinds of issues. But these are things that foresters take into account when they're deciding what type of treatment is effective for that area. So and so it really depends. It's most likely determined by the forester looking at those local conditions and slope and season to find out when that can effectively be done. I won't respond to that last comment. Okay, so I wanted to finish up today by talking about the study that my grad student Shannon worked on in Indiana when I was at Purdue University. We worked with the Division of Forestry to examine one of the state forests, the Morgan Monroe State Forest, which is located right here in beautiful southern Indiana. And we undertook this study to really look at public perceptions of harvesting on this particular land, or people that lived around this land. So we decided to target 2 different types of people. One was recreationists that used this forest, and the others were landowners that lived adjacent to the Morgan Monroe State Forest. So people that were visiting the forest, or people that were living around the forest. And so Shannon did a survey on site with the recreationists, and we conducted a mail survey for the forest landowners that lived adjacent to that property. We asked questions about their attitudes about harvesting. We asked them about the acceptability of management conditions, the desirability of various forest scenes, and the likelihood of visiting these areas and demographics. So this was the informational intervention, if you will. This was the information that we provided as part of this research to determine what the impact of information was on perceptions. So we talked about the benefits and goals of 5 different forest management practices, and I'll describe those in detail in just a minute. 2 to 3 paragraphs, about 180 words. We tried to keep it brief, if you will, but still enough information that the person could get an idea of, well, what are the goals associated with a group selection and opening? Why would you do a group selection opening? Why would you do a clear cut? We designed it at a reading level of about 9th to 11th grade so that it would be in language that non-foresters could understand. So we tried to limit any jargon, anything like that. So we kept the reading level at about 9th to 11th grade. And we also had the photographs as well as the paragraphs reviewed by forestry professionals to determine whether we had any bias in our statements, whether they were accurate, just sort of double checking the validity of the information that we provided in this survey. So what we did was we first asked people a set of questions about acceptability, about how desirable the forest scene is, how likely they are to recreate there, to visit a forest that looks like this. And we asked them that before giving them any information. So we showed them the photographs of a clear cut, of a group selection, all of the forest practices. And then we provided them with the information and asked their attitudes again. So we were able to get a pre and post test worked, pre and post test information for the participants that took the survey. So these are the photographs that we provided to the participants. The validity of the photographs was done before we did the survey with foresters. We actually had all of the photographs and they were not labeled, and we asked the foresters to tell us what silvicultural treatment they thought that the photographs represented. And so we really wanted to have photographs that really both photographs represented that particular treatment. These were the photographs for the clear cut. These were the photographs for the shelterwood. These were the photographs for no harvest. This was a lack of a silvicultural treatment, if you will. And then we had an area that had recently been burned, and so we looked at the influence of fire as well. So those were the 5 silvicultural treatments, or should I say 4 silvicultural treatments that we looked at. And so stand density, of course, that was something that we wanted to look at. Clear cut was the lowest stand density, all the way to no harvest, which was the highest stand density, and fire was would be sort of here in the intermediate, but it wasn't really a stand density treatment. If you're interested in these statistics, we had 60% of recreationists respond to the survey, which was 165 people that returned surveys. For the woodland owners that lived adjacent to the Morgan Monroe State Forest, we had 51% response rate, which amounted to about 1,239 landowners returning the surveys. So what did we find? For the recreationists, I'll draw your attention to this graph here. And just a quick note about the scale. It's a 5-point scale, so 1 was very unacceptable and 5 was very acceptable. So the higher the score, the greater the acceptability. One of the things that we found was that the clear cut was the lowest in terms of acceptability. It was a 2.35 is somewhere in between unacceptable and neutral. The light gray bars are the acceptability after they received information, after they learned about the treatment by reading the information paragraph that we provided. So we can see for all of these, there was a statistically significant increase in acceptability after reading the information. Now, we didn't see huge jumps, but we did see statistically significant increases for all of these. And one of the things that we see is that the unmanaged stand, the one that had no silvicultural treatment, was the one that was found to be most acceptable. So even though everything increased by the provision of information, there's still, it was a nudge in a sense. So they're still not quite as acceptable as not doing anything. So we did see that stand density influenced acceptability. It increased as stand density increased. And we think that maybe respondents had a hard time distinguishing between a shelterwood and a group selection, because it wasn't really clear why the acceptability was higher for shelterwood versus group selection. And we didn't, on the survey, we weren't able to ask sort of why people had these attitudes. So we're just left to wonder what was it about the shelterwood photographs that individuals preferred over the group selection. So the desirability, we also asked how desirable is this scene as a site to encounter on a hiking trail, and how likely are you to visit a forest again if you encountered the scene during a walk through the woods. We found the same thing. As stand density increased, the desirability, the acceptability, likelihood all increased with stand density. And so overall, we did find that providing respondents with information does show a higher acceptability of the forest treatments. And so the results for the landowners were very similar to what we found for the recreationists. Again, the clear cut was the least acceptable treatment, and doing nothing was the most acceptable treatment. And then we saw the use of fire, a shelterwood harvest, group selection were in between. But again, the same types of patterns we saw with the recreationists, all statistically significant differences post information. So information does play a role in acceptability. And if providing a few paragraphs can influence a person's attitudes, imagine what a more in-depth, long-term program could do to influence acceptability and help bring people to help foster that ecological aesthetic. So very similar patterns of desirability and likelihood. People are find landscapes more desirable, more acceptable. They're likely to visit places like this as stand density increases. And interestingly, the landowners found the shelterwood more acceptable than group selection, and so they may have preferred more residual trees within a harvested area. So there were very many similarities between the recreationists and landowners. Very similar patterns of likability, desirability, etc. So we didn't see many significant differences there. And so we see with stand density, acceptability, desirability, and likelihood increases. So people find these types of forests to be more acceptable than the clear cut. So we did find in the study that information can enhance acceptability of forest treatments. And the decrease in acceptability of unharvested forests may show that respondents understood the benefits of harvesting after reading the information. I mean, that was interesting that the acceptability for unmanaged stands actually went down after reading the information. So again, we don't know why, but that might be our working hypothesis, is that landowners actually understood the importance of management after reading the information, and were less likely to favor that particular stand. So we do know that more dense forests are viewed as scenically acceptable. That's something that's been found in previous research. And the acceptability of the intermediate cuts, the shelterwood harvest, the group selection, were viewed in the range of clear cutting and old growth, some of the similar kinds of attitudes that we see out west. And people do prefer scenes with more retention trees, more trees retained. So what are the recommendations, kind of the take-home messages here? Definitely more dense forest stands on public lands will increase the acceptability of forest management practices. But when it's necessary to use silvicultural treatments to manage forests, it's important to think about where those are placed within the forest, because they do affect things like desirability of the scene for hiking, for being able to use that area. And so that was something that was negatively impacted by decreasing stand density. And providing in-depth information to willing stakeholders is something that that many people are interested in, as it was evidenced by the number of people that participated in the survey, by the other studies that we found of providing information. People really want to be able to understand the alternatives so that they can make more informed decisions. Again, a take-home message is that whenever we're thinking about perceptions of forestry, it's all relative. People are going to be looking at a forest condition, and understanding why it exists is very important to how people form their perceptions. And education can help people develop a deeper understanding of forest conditions. And so whenever we can do that to bring in this ecological aesthetic, to foster that ecological aesthetic through education, that's something that we as forestry professionals, as educators, as woodland owners can all help bring society along to a deeper understanding. So promoting this kind of communication and improving relationships between foresters and the public is a really important need. And as the population is growing, we're going to see these kinds of conflicts over public lands and the harvesting and management of those lands. The conflicts are going to continue to potentially grow. So residents that live near forests are really do view themselves as stakeholders in forest operations. And again, this is more so on public lands than private. But we don't want to see lawsuits and ordinances as avenues to prevent harvesting, but rather help them understand the alternatives and the goals associated with them, so at least they can make an informed decision about the forest operations that are going on. So information plays a complex role in acceptability judgments. It can influence perceptions. It's often central to how complex issues like forest management are viewed. But when we have transformative education, education which actually transforms individuals, we really need that to have long-term significant changes in attitudes and knowledge. How can we provide very rich experiential educational experiences? So both the audience and the context of the message should be carefully considered. Something that I mentioned before with studies that were done, in Oregon or at the Hiawatha, really understanding the audience is important when communicating the message. It's important to present clear alternatives that people can choose from, rather than asking them to value something such as a working forest in the abstract. So when you ask people, are they in favor of harvesting, 95% say, no, I'm not. But if you say, are you in favor of harvesting for wood products to build homes, or whatever the purpose is, people are much more likely to support it. Or if it's harvesting for, to improve the productivity and health of that forest. Aesthetics are important. That visual aesthetic is how often that initial emotional response. And it should not be assumed that people will recognize forest management practices or the principles behind them. They often have no idea about of even the term silviculture or what it means. And so the principles about practices are often something that even many woodland owners are still learning about and trying to understand. And so the general public really has a lot to learn. And I think each and every one of us could really play a significant role in helping to foster that ecological aesthetic. Okay, I'd be happy to take any additional questions. I appreciate the feedback from individuals that that had to leave already. So thank you for joining me, and I will stay on the line for any additional questions. My email address and phone number are there. I'd be happy to follow up with any of you at a later time if you do have additional questions after the webinar.
Sure, and a great job. While people are thinking about and writing their questions, I'd like to call their attention to the exit survey that's at the top of the screen. If everyone could please just click that link, it'll open up a new window in your web browser, and then come back. You can answer those questions later, and then come back here and type in your questions for Shorna. So it's important, as we talk about human dimensions and surveys and things like that, it certainly is important that we have everyone respond to these surveys so that we can capture the best possible data and provide for the interests and needs of the audience that we're trying to serve. So with that, I'll stop talking and let people type in their questions.
One question was about using geographic information system as a tool for planning silvicultural management practices. And Peter, you may actually be able to respond to this question as well. But I definitely think the GIS is really helpful for land managers because it allows you to sort of spatially see across a parcel or even the landscape how your individual parcel for species, for water quality, for say threatened and endangered species, et cetera. It allows you to really overlay multiple types of data about the forests and that relates to forests. So I certainly think many foresters do use GIS as a forest management tool because it does allow you to really see the big picture in a way that it may be difficult to do if you're not looking at it in a spatial environment like that.
Yeah, this is Peter. I didn't see the actual question come on, but I know that out west that they've developed, I think the Forest Service has developed some GIS based software that allows for anticipating the visual appearance of a harvest on a hillside. In the east we have maybe less of a concern of that because the topography is quite different than in the west, but those types of tools would certainly have the potential for utility.
And Peter, there was a question about the S-shaped harvest, which
I see that from Dave.
I see
I'm not
more out west.
Okay, I'm not familiar with S-shaped harvests, so maybe Dave can explain it a little bit, or I would have to ask around and see what it is. I'm assuming it's just a serpentine pattern so that you're not able to actually see the whole length of a harvest, and so the visual impact is shortened, so to speak.
Yep. Yes, that's exactly it. And that was one of the alternatives that they were looking at in the Oregon study. So I don't know. They were really playing around with the shape of the harvest, and the visual impact is reduced when you have this sort of, as you serpentine was a good way to describe it. I don't know how common it is in the East.
I haven't heard it referred to other than not by that name. We've used the same concept, if you will, in trying to develop essentially a zigzag when we've done some strip clear cuts and done a zigzag pattern so that we break up the linearness.
Right. Non-linear harvest might be the way that it's referred to more on the East Coast versus West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you everyone for the feedback. I really appreciate it. Lots of great questions tonight.
Yes, interactive
everybody
group.
hung in there until the end.
That was great. So,
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that that definitely having these types of harvests that minimize the issues that people have, which is of course again that emotional response to what it looks like, the visual, is important because you can still conduct the harvest, but still get the visual benefits while also getting the forest management benefits. So it does, I think, fit both of those important criteria of visual and ecological. Yeah, Trevor, I think, your question of how do you address the objectional issue of a single stage growth in a clear cut or other types of even age management, and I think that's what we struggle with. The clear cut was the least preferred. Again, people were more accepting of that after learning about what a clear cut is and why a forester might choose to do that, but it's still very low on the acceptability rating. It's not desirable for hiking or recreating. So I think that remains a significant challenge, which is how do we address clear cuts, for example. And I think visually it's something that's very difficult to overcome. And so this idea of sort of cognitive thinking about clear cuts is important because you really want to somehow counter this emotional response that people have to the visual.
well, I will give a thank you again to Shorna for a wonderful presentation, and thank you all to the audience. Um, I did a quick count using Shorna's numbers today, and the webinars, the Forest Connect webinars, have reached at just over 1,200 participants this year. So we've averaged about 125 per month. So thank you all
Wonderful.
for participating. It's great fun for us, and it's a great. We learn a lot from your questions, and we learn a lot from the opportunity to interact with you all. So thank you all very much. Have a Merry Christmas, and I will look forward to your involvement next year, 2010, the third Wednesday of the month. Thanks, and have a good night.
Yes. Bye-bye, everyone.